December 1984, the Black Sea Fleet Headquarters, Sevastopol. The room is heavy with stale smoke and the low hum of a failing fluorescent light. Rear Admiral Viktor Chernov, a career intelligence officer with the Soviet Navy's Glavnoye Razvedavatelnoye Upravlenie, the GRU, leans over a grainy, water-stained photograph. It was taken from a Turkish fishing trawler, a CIA asset 3 weeks prior. The image shows a strange oblong shape, like a bloated torpedo, being winched onto the deck of a US Navy support vessel in the Mediterranean. His fingers trace the outline. It is not a torpedo. It is a swimmer delivery vehicle, a Mark 8 MOD-1. A submerged taxi for American frogmen. They're SEALs. His eyes shift to a map on the adjacent wall. Pinned ribbons trace the vulnerable arteries of Soviet power, the warm water ports of the Black Sea, the choke point of the Bosporus, and thousands of kilometers east, the critical logistical hubs on the Caspian Sea. From there, men, fuel, and munitions flow south into the landlocked furnace of Afghanistan. A cold realization settles in his gut. The American threat was no longer just ballistic missile submarines lurking in the deep Atlantic. It was here. It was silent. It could surface in the dark beside a fuel pier, a communications cable, or the hull of a moored Slava-class cruiser. The Americans had created a key that could pick the lock of the Soviet Union's southern flank, and the men who held that key operated in shadows the Soviet Navy's sonar could not penetrate. Admiral Chernov's horror was not born of a single battle, but of a profound institutional vulnerability suddenly laid bare. This tactical nightmare emerged from the grand strategic chessboard of the Cold War's most brutal proxy conflict. To understand its roots, we must first navigate the geopolitical terrain that made Soviet admirals look upon their own shores with newfound dread. The Soviet Union was a continental empire with a profound and persistent naval inferiority complex. For centuries, Russian and Soviet strategists had viewed the sea with a mixture of ambition and anxiety. Their geography was a curse. 4 disparate fleets, Northern, Baltic, Black Sea and Pacific, separated by vast landmasses and strategically controlled choke points held by NATO or neutral states. Access to the open ocean was a constant struggle. The Black Sea Fleet, headquartered in the historic port of Sevastopol in Crimea, was essentially trapped behind the Turkish Straits, a narrow, easily monitored passage governed by the 1936 Montreux Convention. To project power globally, the Soviet Navy under Admiral Sergei Gorshkov had invested billions in a massive blue water surface fleet and a formidable submarine force, but it remained at its core a defensive force designed for bastion protection of its ballistic missile subs and anti-access/area denial. This geographical siege mentality bred a specific focus on port security and the sanctity of naval infrastructure. Soviet bases were fortresses, protected by layers of coastal defense batteries, radar stations, patrol boats, and vigilant naval infantry. The threat model was conventional: enemy destroyers, aircraft, missile strikes, or amphibious assault. The paradigm of naval warfare was one of tonnage, missile range, and detectable signatures. The human element, particularly in the maritime domain, was relegated to small, specialized units like the Spetsnaz VMF, Naval Spetsnaz, whose primary wartime mission was the preemptive destruction of NATO naval facilities and command centers. A mirror image doctrine they assumed their adversaries also followed, but on a larger, more conventional scale. Across the Iron Curtain, the United States Navy was cultivating a different kind of maritime warrior. Navy SEALs trace back to the underwater demolition teams, UDTs, of World War II and the Korean War. By 1962, recognizing the need for a unified capability to operate on sea, air and land, President John F. Kennedy, a former PT boat commander himself, formally established the SEAL teams. Their initial focus was on the jungles and rivers of Vietnam, conducting counter-guerrilla and direct action raids. But as the Cold War deepened, their mandate expanded. Navy's Special Warfare Command understood that in a conflict with the USSR, its massive fleets would be engaged in titanic North Atlantic battles. To gain an asymmetric advantage, it would need to strike at the Soviet Navy in its home waters, in its harbors, where it felt most secure. This doctrinal shift gave birth to a clandestine arms race in naval special warfare technology. The Swimmer Delivery Vehicle, SDV, evolved from a simple towed sled into a sophisticated free-flooding mini-submarine. Models like the Mark 8 could transport a team of 6 SEALs and their equipment dozens of nautical miles entirely submerged, navigating by gyro compass and sonar. They were the underwater equivalent of a stealth aircraft, quiet, low magnetic signature, and virtually invisible to surface radar. Alongside the SDVs came advanced closed-circuit diving rigs like the LR-5 rebreather, which produced no telltale bubble trail. A team equipped with these tools could launch from a submerged submarine miles offshore, infiltrate a guarded harbour, attach limpet mines to key vessels, sever underwater communication cables, conduct reconnaissance on defensive installations, and exfiltrate without a trace. Their motto, "The only easy day was yesterday," spoke to a culture of relentless training for the most demanding scenarios imaginable, including the penetration of the Soviet Union's most prized naval bastions. The stage was set, but the catalyst for turning this capability from a theoretical threat into a source of tangible Soviet fear would be a land war in Central Asia. The Soviet Politburo's decision to commit the 40th Army across the Amu Darya River on December 24, 1979, in an attempt to prop up the faltering communist government in Kabul, did more than ignite a decade-long guerrilla conflict. It fundamentally altered the strategic map for both superpowers. For the United States, Afghanistan presented a golden opportunity to bleed the Soviet Union, a Vietnam they could engineer for their adversary. For the Soviet Navy, it created a sprawling, vulnerable logistical tail that stretched from the Baltic and Black Sea ports, across the Volga River system, down to the Caspian Sea, and into the heart of Afghanistan. This logistical chain was the Achilles heel of the entire Soviet war effort. S-Navy and its unique warriors could potentially reach. The Soviet war machine in Afghanistan was fed by a complex and largely invisible pipeline. While the imagery of the conflict centered on dusty mountain passes and BTR-80s rumbling through Kabul, the lifeblood of the 40th Army flowed south across the Caspian Sea. The primary deep-water logistical hubs for the Afghan campaign were the Soviet ports of Baku in the Azerbaijan SSR and Krasnovodsk, now Turkmenbashi, in the Turkmen SSR. Here, in vast, bustling and inherently chaotic port facilities, the material of war was transshipped from rail ferries and cargo ships onto fleets of trucks and trains for the final overland journey into Afghanistan. These ports handled everything from aviation fuel and ammunition to food, spare parts, and personnel. They were nodes of immense strategic value, yet they resided in what was perceived as the Soviet interior, a maritime hinterland assumed to be safe from direct naval attack. This assumption was a dangerous illusion, and American strategists quickly recognized it. The Caspian Sea, though an inland body of water, presented a unique and tantalizing operational environment. It was legally Soviet territory, but geographically, it was a CS. Navy's Special Warfare Development Group, DevGRU, and SEAL Team 6, formed in 1980 explicitly for counter-terrorism and special reconnaissance missions against high-value targets, a sea represented an avenue of approach. Early in the conflict, CIA analysts and Pentagon planners, working through the CIA's Directorate of Operations and its Pakistani counterpart, the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, began wargaming scenarios to disrupt the Soviet logistical flow. Sabotaging the ports of Baku or Krasnovodsk was deemed a high-risk, high-escalation option, but the mere feasibility of such an operation, if the Cold War turned hot, became a strategic weapon in itself. The psychological dimension of this threat cannot be overstated. Soviet military culture, for all its rigidity, possessed a deep-seated paranoia about infiltration and internal subversion. The Great Patriotic War had been won through immense sacrifice, but also through the work of maskirovka, deception. They understood the power of the unseen blow. S-Naval special warfare capabilities. These were not just reports on equipment, they were assessments of a new doctrine. The Americans were training for long-range submerged infiltration. They were perfecting underwater demolitions on hardened structures. Their SDV technology was advancing rapidly. A 1983 NATO exercise observed by Soviet surveillance ships might have included a visible demonstration of fast roping from helicopters or beach assaults, but the truly sensitive evolution, the clandestine submarine launch and harbour penetration, remained hidden, which only amplified Soviet fears. This growing unease within the Soviet Navy coincided with a visible escalation in the CIA's covert action program in Afghanistan. By 1984-85, under the leadership of CIA Director William Casey, the program had evolved from supplying obsolete weapons to a coordinated, large-scale pipeline of sophisticated arms. Made FM-92 Stinger missile in 1986, demonstrated a Western commitment to making the war unbearably costly for the Soviets. For the admirals in Sevastopol and Moscow, this escalation on the ground implied a correlating escalation in covert methods elsewhere. If the Americans were willing to supply man-portable weapons that could down their high-altitude jets and helicopters, what else might they be willing to do? Would they draw the line at using their elite sea-based commandos to strike at the source? The Soviet response was initially fragmented. The Black Sea Fleet and the Caspian Flotilla increased perimeter patrols and random sweeps of harbour areas, with grappling hooks to detect submerged swimmers. Naval infantry units were drilled in anti-saboteur response. But these were defensive, reactive measures. The true horror for the Soviet admirals lay in the offensive potential they could not counter without a massive, costly, and technologically challenging investment. They controlled the surface of their seas, but the Americans, it seemed, were mastering the space just beneath it. Every unexplained sonar contact, every report of a suspicious vessel near territorial waters, every defector's tale about SEAL training exercises fed into a growing institutional anxiety. The security of the motherland's coastline, a sacred duty of the Soviet Navy, was now permeable. This vulnerability was not born on a single day, but crystallized through a series of interlocking realities: the exposure of a critical logistical chain, the observable advancement of enemy special operations capability, and the escalating brutality of the Afghan war, which demanded that every Soviet strategic vulnerability be re-examined. The stage was now set for a silent war of nerves, where capability was as potent as action, and where the fear of the invisible diver became a tangible factor in Soviet naval planning. To comprehend the depth of the Soviet admiral's consternation, one must first step into the polished corridors of the Soviet Navy's headquarters. This was an institution shaped by the towering figure of Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorshkov, who commanded the Navy for nearly 3 decades. Naval supremacy. His focus was on the macro, missile cruisers, strategic submarines, and naval aviation. The concept of warfare was one of scale, of salvos, of steel, and megatonnage. Within this culture, the Spetsnaz VMF were a sharp but relatively small scalpel in a toolbox built for sledgehammer blows. The senior officers who rose under Gorshkov were masters of conventional naval warfare. They thought in terms of battle groups, acoustic signatures, and radar cross-sections. Their threat assessment models were built around NATO surface action groups and ballistic missile submarine patrol areas. The idea that a critical strategic vulnerability could be introduced by a handful of men swimming in the dark, evading billions of rubles worth of detection technology, was neurologically dissonant. It represented a reversion to almost primal commando-style warfare that felt beneath the dignity of a superpower naval clash. This was not an enemy fleet, it was a phantom. SEAL capabilities, particularly their long-range SDV operations, they were often met with a mixture of skepticism and institutional discomfort. Some senior officers dismissed it as diversionary, a clever misinformation campaign to draw resources away from the real threat of carrier battle groups. Others, particularly those with direct responsibility for base security, felt a chill of responsibility. Their careers and the security of the fleet were predicated on the integrity of their defences. The admission that a new, nearly undetectable threat vector existed was a professional indictment. This internal tension between the orthodox, large-scale thinkers and the pragmatists charged with physical security slowed a cohesive response and amplified the sense of unease. The horror was not just at the enemy's capability, but at the looming bureaucratic reckoning it promised within their own rigid system. Navy's continuous investment in swimmer delivery vehicles. By the early 1980s, the Mark Waite MOD-1 was a formidable instrument. It was a wet submersible, meaning its crew compartment flooded and the operators breathed from their own scuba or rebreather apparatus. This made it mechanically simple, incredibly quiet, and capable of diving to depths that avoided surface detection. It was navigated by a pilot using a gyro compass and sonar, and could be launched from the dry deck shelter, DDS, attached to the hull of a modified Sturgeon or Los Angeles-class attack submarine. S-submarine could lurk in international waters, or even hidden within maritime traffic, deploy the SDV and never reveal its own position. The SEALs could travel 20 to 30 nautical miles submerged, conduct their mission and return to the submarine, which would have moved to a pre-arranged extraction point. The entire operation left no surface signature. Complementing the SDV was the life support technology. Open-circuit scuba, used by recreational divers and most combat divers worldwide, emits a stream of exhaled bubbles, a visible and audible trail. S-military's adoption of the Emerson LR5 and later the Draeger LAR5 rebreather changed the calculus. These closed-circuit systems recirculated the diver's exhaled breath, scrubbing out carbon dioxide and replenishing oxygen from a small tank. They produced no bubbles. A diver using a rebreather was effectively invisible to surface visual watch and, critically, to anti-frogman sonar systems that often relied on bubble column detection. Equipped with these, SEALs could hover motionless under a pier or against a ship's hull, undetectable. The Soviet Navy's detection and defense technology struggled to keep pace. Their primary harbor defense systems were designed for a different threat profile. They employed MG7 and MG11 sonars, which were effective against divers using open-circuit gear or swimmers on the surface. But against a bubble-free diver moving slowly or stationary, their effectiveness plummeted. Their physical countermeasures, patrol boats, armed sentries, and underwater grates, were extensive but passive. They represented a perimeter, not a dynamic hunt for infiltrators already inside the wire. The technological gap was not absolute, but it was significant enough to create doubt. And in the domain of special operations and counter-sabotage, doubt is synonymous with vulnerability. For every ruble spent on a new sonar system, the Americans, it seemed, invested in a cheaper, quieter piece of rubber and titanium that could render it obsolete. This pairing, the institutional psyche of the Soviet command and the physical tools wielded by their adversary, created the foundation of the crisis. The next angles would examine how these tools were intended to be used and how the shadow war of intelligence transformed capability into palpable fear. The true power of a special operations force lies not merely in its tools, but in the doctrine governing their use. Naval, Special Warfare, the mission set relevant to the Soviet Union, fell under the categories of Direct Action, and DA, and Special Reconnaissance, das SR. In a full-scale conflict, SEAL teams were tasked with the methodical degradation of the Soviet Navy's ability to fight. This was not random sabotage, it was surgical targeting. Priority objectives, gleaned from years of satellite and signals intelligence, would include the destruction of critical radar and sonar installations guarding harbour mouths, the severing of submerged communication and power cables feeding coastal defence systems, the placement of limpet mines on the hulls of key vessels, especially command ships, nuclear-powered submarines and large auxiliaries, and the disruption of fuel transfer facilities. The operational concept was one of cascading failure. A single successful infiltration could knock out the perimeter sensors of a base, making it vulnerable to follow-on strikes, surface ships or aircraft. The mining of a Slava-class cruiser in its berth would not only destroy a major combatant, but also block a vital pier, creating logistical chaos. SEALs trained relentlessly for these visit, board, search and seizure, VBSS, and underwater demolition tasks on mock-ups of Soviet-style infrastructure. They studied tidal patterns, current flows, and sediment types of potential target areas. Their doctrine emphasized speed, violence of action, and above all, stealthy entry and egress. The goal was to be a ghost, to deliver a catastrophic blow and vanish before the enemy even understood the source of the attack. Conversely, Soviet port security doctrine, while robust on paper, was built for a more conventional, observable threat. It was a layered defense. Outer patrol zones monitored by Grisha-class corvettes and Stenka-class patrol boats, middle layers of fixed hydrophone arrays and patrol diver teams, and inner layers of physical barriers, anti-torpedo nets, booms, and underwater grates, alongside armed guards on piers and vital infrastructure. The Spetsnaz VMF themselves were trained in anti-saboteur operations. However, the doctrine was largely reactive. It assumed an alert would be raised, a sensor triggered, a guard spotting a bubble trail, a patrol boat detecting a sonar contact. The entire system was a gate. SEAL doctrine, leveraging stealth technology, aimed not to break down the gate, but to find the unguarded space beneath it, or to cut the hinges before the gate was even locked. This fundamental mismatch meant that even as Soviet base commanders increased patrols and drills, a lingering doubt remained. Were they defending against the last threat or the next one? The Cold War was, at its core, an intelligence conflict. The SEAL threat to Soviet naval bases was magnified exponentially, not just by training exercises, but by a deliberate and sophisticated campaign of psychological pressure orchestrated by the CIA and its partners. This campaign had two intertwined objectives: to gather actionable targeting data and to convince the Soviets that their vulnerabilities were known and could be exploited. The Central Intelligence Agency, in close coordination with the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, worked to build an exhaustive targeting package for key Soviet maritime facilities. Satellite imagery from the KH-9 Hexagon and KH-11 Kennan series provided detailed layouts of ports like Sevastopol, Baltiysk, and the Caspian facilities. Listening posts in Turkey and Iran monitored Soviet naval communications and radar frequencies. Human intelligence, HUMINT, was the most delicate and valuable layer. The CIA, often using the Pakistani ISI as a cutout, cultivated sources among the Afghan Mujahideen, but also among the wider Muslim diaspora from Soviet Central Asia. A Uzbek merchant sailor visiting Baku, a Turkmen truck driver hauling cargo from Krasnovodsk, each could provide ground-level details on security procedures, shift changes, and physical layouts that satellites could not see. This intelligence was used for more than planning hypothetical missions. Elements of it were selectively and deliberately leaked. Through third-country diplomats, double agents, or controlled media outlets, the KGB and GRU would receive fragments of information suggesting alarming American knowledge, precise schematics of a fuel depot, the patrol schedule of a particular security boat, the technical specifications of a new harbor sonar system. The message was implicit but clear. We see your defenses. We know your routines. Your secure bases are transparent to us. This psychological operation, or PSYOP, was designed to induce paranoia and force costly, reactive investments. Every new fence, every rotated security unit, every hour spent on anti-saboteur drills was a resource not spent on offensive naval operations or the war in Afghanistan. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, the KGB and GRU, were not passive recipients. Naval special warfare, recruiting agents and tasking their own spies within NATO countries. Their findings, however, often confirm their worst fears. Reports on the creation of SEAL Team 6, the procurement of advanced SDVs, and joint NATO exercises emphasizing harbor penetration all painted a picture of a dedicated, well-funded and aggressive capability aimed squarely at the Soviet homeland. The intelligence war thus created a feedback loop of dread. Western efforts to understand Soviet vulnerabilities confirmed to the Soviets that they were vulnerable and that the enemy was preparing to strike. This silent battle of wits and wills set the conditions for a decisive, though largely hidden, turning point, a moment where theoretical vulnerability transformed into a concrete crisis of confidence within the Soviet high command. The Soviet Admiralty's abstract anxiety coalesced into concrete, operation-altering fear through a series of incidents and intelligence revelations between 1984 and 1986. These were not battle reports from Afghanistan, but quiet breaches in what should have been the USSR's most secure maritime domains. They served as undeniable proof that the theoretical threat of Western naval commandos was a tangible, practiced, and imminent danger. The first category of incidents involved direct, observable intrusions during NATO exercises. The most notorious of these was linked to Exercise Teamwork 86, a massive NATO maritime exercise in the North Norwegian Sea. While the surface exercise involved hundreds of ships and aircraft, a far more clandestine operation ran in its shadow, and British Special Boat Service SBS units, using SDVs launched from the submerged HMS Onyx and the USS Billfish, conducted covert reconnaissance and simulated sabotage missions against enemy port facilities in Norway. The sites chosen for these drills bore a striking resemblance to Soviet bases on the Kola Peninsula. While the details of these operations remain classified, the scale and audacity were impossible to completely conceal. Soviet intelligence-gathering trawlers and satellites monitoring Teamwork 86 would have noted curious absences. periods where certain Allied submarines were unaccounted for, or where unusual small craft activity was reported near fjord heads. The GRU analysts piecing together these fragments understood the implication. The exercises were a dress rehearsal, and the rehearsal involved penetrating hardened NATO facilities that stood in for their own. The second and more psychologically impactful category was the defection and debriefing of key personnel. In 1985, a Polish naval intelligence officer with detailed knowledge of Warsaw Pact port security protocols defected to the West. His debriefings included exhaustive descriptions of Soviet-era harbor defenses, their technical limitations, and standard operating procedures for counter-saboteur patrols. This information was a goldmine for SEAL planners, but the fact of the defection itself was a seismic shock to Moscow. It meant the entire defensive playbook was potentially compromised. Navy diver defector in the late 1970s or early 1980s, a man who provided the KGB with intimate knowledge of SDV capabilities, dive profiles, and infiltration tactics. Special warfare community. The third incident was a real-world security failure in a neutral port. In 1985, a Soviet Slava-class cruiser, a symbol of Gorshkov's new navy, made a port visit to Split, Yugoslavia. During the visit, Yugoslav security personnel detained 2 individuals in a small boat conducting suspicious underwater surveying near the cruiser's berth. They were not caught in the act, but their equipment and false documents raised alarms. Operation, the incident was reported up the chain to Moscow Center. For the Navy High Command, it was a nightmare scenario played out in a friendly harbor. If unidentified divers could reconnoiter a capital ship during a diplomatic visit, what could a dedicated SEAL team do to that same ship in its home port during wartime? The event validated their deepest fears. The threat was not confined to war games, it was present wherever their ships sailed. The cumulative effect of these incidents was synthesized into a single, devastating GRU assessment report, circulated in late 1986 to the Chief of the Soviet General Staff and the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. Its contents were not. SEAL and British SBS units supported by submerged submarines could successfully infiltrate the primary bases of the Northern, Baltic and Black Sea fleets. It highlighted the specific vulnerabilities of the Caspian flotilla's logistics hubs, noting their relative lack of defense in depth compared to frontline European bases. The report concluded that current Soviet countermeasures were insufficient to guarantee the security of the fleet at its moorings, and that a successful sabotage campaign in the opening hours of a conflict could cripple the USSR's ability to contest sea control, secure its SSBN bastions, or sustain its forces in peripheral theaters like Afghanistan. This document was the turning point. It moved the issue from the realm of worried base commanders and intelligence analysts to the pinnacle of Soviet military power. The horror was no longer speculative. It was an officially endorsed high-probability assessment. The question was no longer if the Americans could do it, but when they would try and how to stop them. The circulation of the GRU's damning assessment triggered a quiet tsunami within the Soviet Naval Command. Meetings in Moscow and Sevastopol moved from speculative discussion to urgent, resource-focused planning. The psychological impact was profound. The very concept of bastion security, the core tenet of Soviet naval strategy to protect its ballistic missile submarines in fortified near-shore areas, was now seen as fundamentally flawed if the bastions themselves could be silently penetrated. This was not merely a base security issue, it was an existential threat to the USSR's second strike nuclear capability. The Admiral's horror translated into a multi-pronged, costly and frantic response that would reshape the Soviet Navy's priorities in the final years of the Afghan War and the Cold War. The first and most visible response was a massive reallocation of resources to physical hardening and sensor networks. Budgets were diverted to encase critical underwater communication cables and power lines feeding coastal defences in armoured concrete conduits. The vulnerable points where these lines entered facilities, previously identified in Western targeting exercises, became fortified strongpoints. Harbour entrances were fitted with enhanced layered anti-swimmer nets equipped with magnetic and acoustic sensors. The development and deployment of new detection systems like the improved MG-117 Bay sonar was accelerated. This system was designed to be towed by patrol boats, providing a wider, more sensitive search pattern for underwater intruders. Research into non-acoustic detection methods, such as systems designed to detect the chemical signature or thermal plume of a rebreather, received increased funding, though with limited practical success. The second response was an organizational and doctrinal shift within the Spetsnaz VMF and naval infantry. Prior to the mid-1980s, the primary wartime mission of naval Spetsnaz was offensive, to raid NATO ports and command centers. Now, a significant portion of their training and force structure was retasked for defensive counter-sabotage, SAI-SABI operations. New rapid reaction companies were formed and stationed at high-priority bases like Polyarny, Northern Fleet, Baltijsk, Baltic Fleet, and Sevastopol. Their training scenarios changed dramatically. Instead of practicing attacks on mock piers, they now drilled in hunting and neutralizing simulated SEAL teams that had already infiltrated their home ports. This involved complex underwater clearance operations, harbor-wide search patterns using multiple small craft and live fire drills in the confined, echo-prone environments of dry docks and fuel piers. The mindset shifted from being the hunter abroad to being the besieged guardian at home. The third and most secretive response was a dramatic escalation in active measures and counter-surveillance, S and UK naval special warfare communities. The goal was not just to gather information on capabilities, but to identify operational plans, technical specifications for SDVs, and optimistically, to recruit assets within the teams themselves. Simultaneously, counterintelligence sweeps within Soviet naval bases and associated research institutes intensified. The paranoia was internalized. Every engineer working on sonar technology, every harbour master with knowledge of patrol schedules became a potential source of a leak that could guide an American SDV to its target. Security clearances were re-evaluated. The fear of the diver outside the wire was now matched by a fear of the traitor within. Perhaps the most telling indicator of the turning point's depth was the impact on operational planning for the Afghan war. As submarine launch points, the perceived vulnerability now influenced decision-making. Contingency plans were drafted for the rapid dispersal of critical shipping from Baku and Krasnovodsk in the event of heightened tensions. The movement of high-value cargo, particularly nuclear weapons components or advanced aircraft destined for the 40th Army, received an additional layer of secrecy and naval infantry escort. The war in Afghanistan was a land conflict, but its sustainability was now seen as partly dependent on securing a maritime rear area from a threat that had, just years before, been considered negligible. By late 1987, the transformation was evident to Western intelligence. Satellite imagery showed the physical changes to Soviet bases: new nets, new guard towers, new construction around pier heads. Signals intelligence picked up new, intensive radio traffic associated with harbor security drills. Human intelligence reported on the heightened state of alert and the new focus of Spetsnaz training. S-intelligence community understood the message. The Soviet Navy had received the signal. The psychological operation had achieved its ultimate goal. The mere capability of the SEALs and their SDVs had forced one of the world's two superpower navies to spend millions, retrain thousands, and rewire its defensive psyche, all to counter a handful of men who had yet to fire a single shot in anger against them. This costly, fear-driven reaction formed the immediate aftermath of the crisis, but its consequences would ripple far beyond the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Navy's institutional pivot in response to the SEAL threat had immediate and long-term consequences. The Soviet Navy's reaction to the perceived SEAL threat in the latter half of the 1980s was comprehensive, costly, and strategically distorting. It resulted in what analysts later termed the fortress complex, an inward-turning, defensive-minded posture that consumed resources and mental energy at a time when the fleet faced profound challenges abroad, and the Soviet state itself was beginning to falter. The most immediate and tangible consequences were the physical and budgetary transformations of key naval facilities. Across the four fleets, but especially in the Northern Fleet's bastions on the Kola Peninsula and the Black Sea Fleet's home at Sevastopol, construction projects multiplied. Advanced Norwegian-made hydrophones acquired through covert channels were integrated with indigenous sonar arrays to create layered underwater surveillance fences. The venerable Stenker-class patrol boats, workhorses of harbour defence, were supplemented by dedicated anti-saboteur boats like the Project 104-110 Svetliak class, equipped with rapidly traversing searchlights, gyro-stabilised heavy machine guns, and improved shallow water sonar. The moles and breakwaters protecting submarine pens were reinforced with submerged sensors and remotely activated charges designed to create disabling underwater shockwaves against approaching swimmers or SDVs. The financial toll was immense. In an era of growing economic stagnation under perestroika, the Soviet military budget was under unprecedented strain. The war in Afghanistan was a continuous financial drain. Every ruble allocated to pouring concrete around underwater cables in Crimea was a ruble not spent on modernizing the surface fleet, developing next-generation attack submarines, or maintaining the strategic missile submarine force, the crown jewel of Soviet naval power. The opportunity cost was severe. S-Navy was investing in Aegis combat systems and stealth technology. A significant portion of the Soviet Navy's capital was being sunk, literally and figuratively, into static defense. This diversion accelerated the qualitative gap between the two navies, a gap that would become glaringly apparent in the post-Cold War era. The human and doctrinal aftermath was equally significant. The reorientation of naval Spetsnaz toward counter-sabotage had a corrosive effect on their primary offensive mission. Training time is finite. The hundreds of hours spent rehearsing harbor clearance, underwater knife fighting, and close-quarters battle in pump houses were hours not spent practicing long-range reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines raids, or the intricate art of mining enemy warships in their own ports, the very skills that would have been critical in a war with NATO. This created a dangerous paradox. In trying to defend against an enemy's special operations capability, the Soviets degraded their own. The professional morale of these elite units also suffered. The esprit de corps of a Spetsnaz soldier is built on being the tip of the spear, the hunter in the dark. Being reassigned to guard duty, even of the most elite variety, was seen by many as a diminishment of their strategic role. Furthermore, the pervasive fear of infiltration bred an atmosphere of suspicion and operational rigidity. Base commanders, now hyper-aware of the potential for catastrophic sabotage, became risk-averse. Unusual but benign activities, a civilian research vessel taking water samples, a fishing boat straying too close, could trigger disproportionate and sometimes dangerous responses. This climate hampered the normal, flexible functioning of the bases. The freedom of action for Soviet submarines and surface ships, the very lifeblood of a navy, could be subtly constrained by the overwhelming priority given to protecting the fixed infrastructure they sailed from. This strategic myopia was perhaps most starkly illustrated by the situation in the Caspian flotilla. SEAL team appearing in the landlocked Caspian was logistically fantastical. The psychological contagion of fear had spread. The logistics hubs of Baku and Krasnovodsk received security upgrades modeled on those in Sevastopol. Patrols were intensified. This meant that resources were stretched even thinner, and the focus of the flotilla's leadership was split between supporting the war in Afghanistan and defending against a phantom maritime threat. The net effect was a less efficient, more paranoid logistical pipeline for the 40th Army at the very moment the Mujahideen, armed with stingers and better tactical coordination, were making that pipeline's contents burn across the skies and mountains of Afghanistan. Psychological operations, but it came at a steep price for the Soviets. It locked them into a reactive posture, consumed scarce resources, and diverted attention from the bleeding wound of Afghanistan. Yet, the story did not end with the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 or the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. The lessons learned and the fears incubated in this period would profoundly shape the naval doctrine of the emergent Russian Federation. The immediate defensive scramble had long-term echoes. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not erase the institutional memory of the SEAL threat from the minds of Russian naval commanders. Many of the admirals and intelligence officers who had lived through the anxiety of the mid-1980s retained their positions or passed their operational mindset to a new generation in the Russian Federation's Navy. The psychological and doctrinal scars of that period became deeply embedded, evolving to fit a new geopolitical reality marked by a shrunken fleet, but persistent, even heightened vulnerability. The Russian Navy of the 1990s was a shadow of its Soviet predecessor, chronically underfunded, rusting at its peers, and plagued by morale collapse. Yet even in this era of neglect, the protection of strategic naval infrastructure remained a non-negotiable priority. The fear of asymmetric, special operations-style attacks migrated seamlessly from the Cold War context to new perceived threats: Chechen separatists, Georgian commandos, or Western special forces exploiting Russia's temporary weakness. The physical security measures hardened in the 1980s. The sensor nets, the reinforced cables, the rapid reaction Spetsnaz units were among the few systems that saw sustained, albeit minimal, maintenance. They represented a last line of defense for a crumbling force. This ingrained paranoia found fresh fuel in the post-2000 resurgence of the Russian state under Vladimir Putin. As oil revenues funded a military modernization program, the Navy's rebuilding efforts reflected the old fears. New corvettes and patrol ships like the Steregushchi and Gremyashchi classes were designed not for blue water dominance but for the green water defense of coastal approaches and bastions. They were outfitted with sophisticated anti-saboteur systems as standard. The Palmer and Duet close-in weapon systems, while designed for missiles and aircraft, were touted for their potential against small, fast-surface and subsurface threats. The institutional obsession with protecting the Borei and Yasen-class submarine bases on the Kola Peninsula mirrors the Cold War bastion mentality, now intensified by the understanding that these new submarines represent the core of Russia's strategic deterrent. Furthermore, the Russian military's experiences in Syria since 2015 have provided a real-world laboratory for these defensive protocols. The naval facility at Tartus, Russia's only Mediterranean warm water port, is a direct successor to the vulnerable logistic hubs of the Soviet era. Its defense employs a multi-layered approach clearly derived from the 1980s playbook: underwater surveillance nets, constant patrols by Raptor-class fast attack boats, and a permanent detachment of Spetsnaz from the Russian naval infantry, Naval Special Warfare. The defensive posture at Tartus is not just about defending a base, it is about exercising an old ghost. Naval Special Warfare, intelligence proved that the SEAL's core strategic premise was correct. A small, elite force could exert a psychological and material influence disproportionate to its size. The billions of rubles spent by the Soviets were the ultimate metric of success. This validation fueled exponential growth in the community's budget, influence, and mandate after the Cold War. SEAL Team 6, originally formed for a specific Cold War task, evolved into the Joint Special Operations Command's premier maritime counterterrorism unit. The techniques of submerged infiltration, long-range SDV operation, and harbour reconnaissance were not retired. They were refined and became foundational for a global war on terror that often required discreet access to denied coastal areas. The technology race also continued unabated. The Dry Deck Shelter DDS program, the Advanced SEAL Delivery System, ASDS, though plagued with problems, and the current Shallow Water Combat Submersible SWCS program are all lineal descendants of the Mark 8 MOD-1 that first alarmed Soviet admirals. The goal remains the same: to deliver operators undetected anywhere in the world's littorals. The modern SEAL is the embodiment of a threat that once forced a superpower to look inward and fortify its shores, a testament to the enduring power of the asymmetric maritime operator. Thus, the aftermath of this silent confrontation is a world shaped by its legacy. Russia builds its new navy with a defensive hunch, forever watching the dark water beside its peers. The United States continues to invest in the tools and men who can swim through that darkness. The horror experienced in Sevastopol's briefing rooms in the 1980s was not an endpoint, but the beginning of a permanent shift in how navies perceive vulnerability, where the greatest threat may not be a carrier battle group on the horizon, but a silent, bubble-free breath in the shadow of a hull. This legacy brings us to a final, broader reflection on what this episode meant for the nature of warfare, power, and fear. Naval Special Warfare and the Soviet Admiralty transcends a mere historical footnote of the Cold War. It stands as a profound case study in the psychology of power and the true nature of military deterrence. This was not a clash of fleets, but a clash of paradigms. On one side, a superpower whose strength was quantified in missile tubes, ship tonnage, and the sheer visible mass of its arsenal. On the other, a deliberate investment in the small, the silent, and the human. A bet that the most sophisticated defenses could be undone by a handful of determined men with rudimentary yet exquisite tools. The Soviet admiral's horror was, at its root, the shock of recognition. They saw in the SEALs and their SDVs a darker reflection of their own Spetsnaz ethos, the belief that a precisely applied force could unhinge a vastly superior enemy. But the American capability implied something more unnerving, a technological and doctrinal edge that allowed this principle to be applied not at the vulnerable edges of empire, but at its very heart, against the symbols and instruments of its strategic power. The fear was rational. It was the fear of a checkmate move they had not anticipated on their own board. This episode illuminates a fundamental truth of strategy, that capability often carries the same weight as action. The SEALs did not need to mine the docks of Sevastopol or Baku. They merely needed to prove through relentless training, technological innovation, and calculated leaks of intelligence that they could. In doing so, they achieved the ultimate asymmetric effect. They compelled their adversary to spend his own resources, divert his own attention, and tie down his own elite forces in a defensive, reactive posture. The fortress complex was a monument not to Soviet strength, but to American psychological and operational ingenuity. It was a victory won without a single explosive charge being detonated in anger against its intended target. Historically, the legacy of this fear is etched into the geography of modern Russian naval bases and the design of its new warships. It serves as a permanent lesson that in the modern era, national security is not defined solely by borders in the traditional sense, but by the integrity of invisible perimeters, digital, subterranean, and in this case, subsurface. The waterline where the sea meets the land is no longer a clean boundary of sovereignty, but a permeable membrane through which special operations can flow. Finally, this story reflects the enduring human element at the core of technological warfare. Amidst the satellites, the sonar arrays, and the submersibles, the pivotal factor was human perception. The analyst's dread in Sevastopol, the SEAL's stamina in freezing Blackwater, the planner's cunning in Langley. The Cold War was a conflict of systems, but it was decided by nerves, will, and imagination. The Soviet admirals were not horrified by machines, but by the intent and skill of the men who wielded them. In the end, the most potent weapon was not the swimmer delivery vehicle itself, but the chilling possibility it represented, a possibility that forced a giant to look down and to fear the shadows at its own feet.